On the 26th of April 1923, Prince Albert, Duke of York, married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at Westminster Abbey. He was the younger son of King George V of the United Kingdom, and she came from a largely Scottish noble family. Albert, known to his family as Bertie, was not supposed to become a king, and Elizabeth was never meant to be a queen. That duty was intended to fall to Bertie's older brother, Edward. Had he been the heir to the throne, it is likely Albert's parents would have pushed him to marry a daughter of one of Europe's royal households. But fate would align in strange ways. 13 years later, Albert's older brother briefly became king in January 1936 and abdicated in December. Thus, Bertie was thrust into taking up a crown he never wanted. It was only then that the wisdom of his marriage became clear. As King George VI, Bertie relied greatly on his wife to overcome his own natural shyness and reserved character. With Elizabeth by his side, his reign was a successful one, leading Britain through the Second World War and the shifting position of the monarchy in its aftermath. This is the story of King George VI and the Queen Mother, the unlikely King and Queen of the United Kingdom. The man known to history as King George VI of Britain was born as Albert Frederick Arthur George on the 14th of December 1895 at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, England. His father was Prince George, Duke of York, a grandson of Queen Victoria who, at the time of Albert's birth, was nearing the end of her 6th decade on the throne of Britain. She was also the first Empress of India and ruled the vast British overseas empire on which it was said the sun never set. Until shortly before Albert's birth, Prince George had been out of the direct line of succession to the throne. Once Victoria died, George's father, Albert, Prince of Wales, would become king. But it had been assumed until the early 1890s that George's older brother, Albert Victor, as Victoria's eldest male heir, would ascend to the throne in due course. However, Albert Victor died prematurely in 1892, ensuring that the future George VI's father became second in line to the throne from 1892 onwards. Thus, Albert was born in 1895 into a household which would someday most likely constitute Britain's immediate royal family, with his father as king and his mother as queen consort. However, Albert was not his father's heir. An older brother, Edward, had been born in the summer of 1894, a year and a half before Albert, and Edward was third in line to the throne. Consequently, from the moment he was born in the winter of 1895, Albert was the fourth in line to the throne of Britain, though he would only succeed to that position should something ever happen to displace his older brother Edward. As we shall see, something did occur. Albert's mother was Mary of Teck, a member of the German royal house of Teck, which held extensive estates in the unified German Empire. Albert was her and George's second child after Edward. 4 more children would follow: Mary in 1897, Henry in 1900, George in 1902, and John in 1905, though John suffered from severe epilepsy, from which he would die in 1919 when only 13 years of age. Albert, who quickly became known to his family as Bertie, the same name given to his grandfather, was baptized at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham, just a few weeks after he was born. Thereafter, he was largely reared in a separate household to his parents, an entirely normal practice amongst the royal families of Europe in the 19th century. This continued through his early childhood years, during which Albert, Edward, and their growing brood of siblings were chaperoned between royal palaces and cottages, taught by tutors in the standard subjects of the Victorian educational curriculum, which in those days still involved learning Latin and had a strong focus on the classics of ancient Greek and Roman literature. Albert's parents were distant figures, who some historians and observers have since deemed to have been neglectful. This is too harsh an assessment, and if they seemed to be cold parents, it was in line with the conventions of the time. Albert's father was also a strict disciplinarian. It was perhaps on account of the traumatic elements of his youth that he began to suffer from a stutter in his younger years, one which would continue to plague him into adulthood, though, as we will see, he largely triumphed over it in his 30s, well before he became king. When he was just 14 years old, Albert was sent to the Royal Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, a training school for royals and sons of the British aristocracy to train as officer cadets. This followed a well-established tradition, and Albert's father had also been sent to join the British Royal Navy when he was barely a teenager. Albert, it must be said, was not a great student of any kind. He came bottom of his class in the cadets' final exam at Osborne, while he was physically not predisposed to seafaring, having suffered from stomach issues as a youth. His confidence was also low in his younger years, in part owing to his stutter, and also because of having been forced to learn to write with his right hand, even though he was left-handed. Although it seems nonsensical to the modern mind, this was a common feature of schooling in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was also while he was at Osborne that his grandfather, King Edward VII, died. With this, his father ascended the throne as King George V, and Albert's older brother Edward became the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. Albert was now second in line to the throne, though something unexpected would need to befall Edward for him to ever become king. Meanwhile, in the early 1910s, he continued to progress through the Royal Navy, joining the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth after his sojourn at Osborne, and then taking in several training tours in 1912 and 1913, voyages which saw him traversing much of the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, and off the seaboard of North America. In late 1913, he was finally posted to HMS Collingwood as a midshipman. Albert was still struggling to find his sea legs, an occupational hazard for a mariner, as diplomatic tensions were building in Europe in 1914. For decades, the continent's great powers had been engaged in ongoing rivalries for regional power in Europe and for possession of colonies overseas in Africa and southern Asia. Russia and Britain, for instance, had been rivals for a time in Central Asia, where they both had interests in countries like Afghanistan. The French and the Italians both had interests in North Africa and the Horn of Africa. Since the 1890s, Germany, which had emerged as a major power on the continent following unification in 1871, began trying to build its own overseas empire. Armed alliances had even developed, with Britain, France, and Russia forming the Triple Entente, and Germany having a long-standing alliance with the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Yet, despite these rivalries, a major conflict had been avoided for many years. As a result, when diplomatic tensions began brewing between Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Serbia in the Balkans in July 1914, many believed that this crisis, like many before it, would pass quickly. It did not, and in the final days of July, tensions escalated rapidly, leading to a succession of declarations of war. By early August, nearly every country in Europe had committed to one side or another, as Britain, France, and Russia went to war with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The First World War had commenced. In the early stages of it, Albert was fighting another kind of conflict, one with his appendix. In late August, a medical evaluation determined that he needed to have his operated upon, and when his ship made port in the Scottish city of Aberdeen, it was removed. After a sufficient period of rest and convalescence, he returned to service on board the HMS Collingwood. The ship spent most of the war stationed in the North Sea, patrolling the vast waters between Britain north to Iceland and east towards Norway. While Britain was the preeminent naval power of the day and had been so for 2 centuries, the Germans had spent an enormous amount of money building a sizable navy in the 10 or so years leading up to the war. Accordingly, there was an expectation that major naval engagements would occur in the North Atlantic before long, but in the end, the war at sea was very limited by comparison with the carnage occurring in the trenches of the Western Front in France. Therefore, Albert spent much of late 1914, all of 1915, and into early 1916 on board the Collingwood, undertaking gunnery drills and patrols in the waters north of Scotland, but seeing little active engagement with the enemy. Albert was present for the largest naval clash between Britain and Germany during the war. The Battle of Jutland took place over the course of the 31st of May and the 1st of June 1916 in the waters off the coast of western Denmark and northwestern Germany, as both sides sought to score a tactical breakthrough at sea which might turn the course of the war. The British had the greater number of ships, with just over 150 vessels, 28 of them being the dreadnought battleships, the foremost military vessel of the day, supplemented by nearly 80 destroyer-class ships. The German armada was just under 100 ships, with just 16 dreadnoughts. Over 60% of its vessels were torpedo boats, and the German attack would rely on these scoring a number of hits before they ran out of torpedoes in order for the Germans to emerge out of the clash victorious. In the ensuing naval melee, Albert served as a junior officer aboard HMS Collingwood. He performed well during the battle and was mentioned as such in the dispatches, but the battle was a mixed affair overall. As the British and German fleets engaged with each other across a large stretch of sea, the Germans ultimately scored more hits, sinking 14 ships while only losing 11, while the British also lost a disproportionately higher number of destroyers and larger battleships, and over twice as many mariners. As such, the Germans statistically won the Battle of Jutland, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, one in which the Germans lost vital naval resources. In its aftermath, Berlin decided to prioritize submarine warfare, and there would be no second major naval clash of this kind again during the First World War. Albert would spend much of the war away from active service, in large part owing to renewed ill health. Early in 1917, he began suffering from a duodenal ulcer, and he would eventually have to have this operated on early that winter. When he returned to duty, it was as part of the burgeoning RAF, the Royal Air Force, which was formed on the 1st of April 1918 as the first independent air force operated by any nation anywhere in the world, a sign of how air warfare had become a central component of military conflict in the course of the war, where at its outset planes had been used almost exclusively for reconnaissance missions. As a result of this decision, Albert became the first member of the British royal family to hold a pilot's license, while in October 1918 he would fly over the English Channel after being posted to France. The newly created RAF only had a limited role to play in the war in the end, though. By the summer of 1918, the trajectory of the war was clear. The entry of the United States into the conflict on the side of Britain and France the previous year had brought an insurmountable amount of resources to bear against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. In the end, before victory was won on the field of battle, political unrest across Central Europe brought about the collapse of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, bringing the war to an end in November 1918. In the aftermath of the war, Bertie returned to land and civilian life. He began studying at Cambridge University in the autumn of 1919. He was 23 years of age commencing his time in college, but this was not unusual in the post-war years, when many freshman students were young men heading towards their mid-20s who had spent their late teens and early 20s in the trenches in France. He began attending Trinity College there alongside his brother, Prince Henry, who was 4 years his junior. Albert chose to study history primarily and was tutored by Reginald Lawrence, the editor of the Cambridge Modern History and an expert on both ecclesiastical history and the French Revolution, though the most substantial scholar to teach Albert at this time was Dennis Robertson, an economic historian and close colleague of John Maynard Keynes, the founder of the Keynesian economic theory. At Cambridge, Louis Greig, whom Albert had known since his days at Osborne a decade earlier, was employed as Bertie's equerry or royal assistant. They developed a keen friendship over their shared interest in tennis, and the pair would later play together at the championships at Wimbledon. Albert's time at Cambridge, though, was cut short after just 3 terms, as he was increasingly drawn into becoming a working royal in the early 1920s, spending much of his time from 1920 onwards visiting industrial factories and mines across England as the monarchy sought to establish closer ties to the working classes in Britain at a time when radical socialism was on the front foot across Europe. Because he was the second son of the king, and at a time when premature death was beginning to decline dramatically, it was expected in the 1910s and 1920s that Albert would never be King of Britain. Therefore, he was given something of a free hand to choose his own marriage partner, a relatively novel development for a monarch's child. Had he been born in the 19th century, for instance, a marriage to a daughter of one of Europe's royal households would most likely have been arranged. Nevertheless, when Albert began an affair in 1919 with Sheila Chisholm, it aroused consternation in the royal establishment. This Australian it-girl of the 1910s was already married to Francis Sinclair Erskine, Lord Loughborough. Bertie met Sheila after his older brother Edward began seeing Chisholm's best friend, Freda Dudley Ward. The relationship dragged on for almost a year before King George, exasperated by the situation, instructed Bertie to leave this, quote, already married Australian. Albert was not happy with doing so, but obeyed his father's command. His brother's unwillingness to abide by a similar injunction from the king over a decade later would have striking consequences for both Edward and Albert in the long run. In the shorter term, Albert was compensated for ending his affair with Lady Loughborough by being invested with the title of Duke of York in 1920, one of the most historically significant peerages in British history, and one which had been vacant since his father abandoned the title upon becoming king in 1910. Bertie's attentions were soon drawn elsewhere in his quest for a marriage partner. Shortly after ending his relationship with Lady Loughborough, he met Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at an engagement. They had known each other as children, but had not crossed paths in several years. By the time they met again, Elizabeth was just entering her 20s, and Albert, by then in his mid-20s, was evidently smitten. He proposed in 1921, but Elizabeth turned down his offer, fearful that entering the royal family and the public gaze that came with it would result in her being stifled and unable to express her true self in years to come. Bertie, though, would not take no for an answer, and was determined to woo her. A second marriage proposal came, following Albert's sister Mary's wedding to the heir to the Viscount Lascelles in February 1922, at which Elizabeth had acted as a bridesmaid. She again said no, but further months of courtship evidently swayed her, and in January 1923, despite her reservations about entering the royal establishment, she said yes to Albert on his third time of asking. The wedding was swiftly organised, and the couple were married at Westminster Abbey in London on the 26th of April 1923. Thereafter, they proceeded on their honeymoon, at the start of which Elizabeth contracted whooping cough, in what she later called a thoroughly unromantic development. Despite this inauspicious beginning, the marriage was to be a notably happy one by the standards of many royal unions, and Albert and Elizabeth had a genuine affection for one another. It was, in many ways, the first modern royal marriage in British history. While the honeymoon might have been interrupted by a bout of whooping cough, there was inevitably a longer diplomatic tour to be undertaken by the couple following their marriage. It was typical for newlywed senior royals at this time to tour the British Empire, so that in an age before television, the people of India, Canada, and many other parts of Britain's dominions could have an opportunity to see the new member of the royal family. This commenced with a visit to Northern Ireland in July 1924, no doubt in an effort to reassure the Unionist community there of Crown support for their continued presence within the United Kingdom following the establishment of the Irish Free State on the rest of the island during the early 1920s. A tour of Britain's colonies in Africa followed, taking in Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, as well as Aden in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, though the Duke and Duchess of York avoided Egypt, where the British Governor-General, Sir Lee Stack, had just been assassinated on the streets of Cairo in November 1924. They returned to England for a time thereafter in order for Elizabeth to give birth to their first child in 1926, a daughter named Elizabeth after her mother. She was the first of their two children, with another girl named Margaret following in 1930. As soon as Elizabeth was born in 1926 and her mother had recovered, the Duke and Duchess resumed their tour of Britain's overseas colonies. In 1927, they headed west across the Atlantic. They first visited Jamaica, where Albert notably played a doubles tennis match alongside Bertrand Clark, an all-round sporting figure who had competed internationally in golf, tennis, and cricket. In 1924, Clark had become the first black athlete to compete at the Wimbledon Tennis Championships in London, a tournament which Albert had himself competed at in 1926, partnering his friend and mentor Louis Greig, the Scottish naval surgeon who had served as his equerry at Cambridge, in the men's doubles event. Admittedly, they were soundly beaten in the first round, but Albert remains the only British royal to have competed at the championships, having done so when the championships were still an amateur event. Albert's decision to play alongside Clark in Jamaica the following year was seen as an inclusive decision which embraced the wider Jamaican population. It was probably simply more in line with Albert's personality that he innocently decided to play a game of tennis and wasn't considering the political overtones of doing so at all. Thereafter, he and Elizabeth proceeded onwards to the Pacific Ocean, visiting Fiji, New Zealand and Australia, before returning to Britain after taking in many of the Empire's countries in the mid-1920s. While in Australia, Albert oversaw the formal opening of the newly built Parliament House in the capital city, Canberra. He delivered a speech during this event, one which was well delivered. This would not have been possible just a year or two earlier. Bertie's stutter had not retreated with the passage of the years, and by the mid-1920s had become a problem. When he had given the closing speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in October 1925, the ceremony had been an endurance test for both Albert and his listeners, with the Duke struggling to deliver his lines. In its aftermath, he determined to do something to confront the stutter which had plagued him since his youth. Thus, although the acclaimed film The King's Speech depicts Albert as having employed him much later in the lead up to and opening stages of the Second World War, it was actually in 1926 that Bertie first began working with Lionel Logue, an Australian former stage actor turned speech and language therapist. Logue's methods were unusual by the standards of the 1920s, and he was considered a quack by many in the medical community. But his regimen of daily vocal exercises and conscious relaxing of the throat muscles proved enormously successful in Albert's case. Already, when he had opened the Parliament House in Canberra in 1927, the Duke's speech was much improved, and his voice did not falter on that occasion. He continued to work with Logue intermittently over the next 20 years, and in 1937, at the time of his coronation, he honoured the Australian by making him a member of the Royal Victorian Order with promotion to the rank of Commander in 1944. More broadly, Albert grew into himself in the 1920s. He was a changed man following his marriage and after becoming a father, and unlike his own father and grandfather, his parenting style was a warm, modern one, rather than being a cold, distant presence in his daughters' lives. The family originally lived at White Lodge in Richmond Park in London, but they moved to a more modest home in Piccadilly in 1926. During these years, the Duke and Duchess became known for their philanthropy. Bertie, for instance, founded the Industrial Welfare Society, through which he met with trade unionists and other leaders of industrial workers to try to gain a greater understanding of the material existences of Britain's workers and how their lot could be improved at a time when industrial communities in much of England and Scotland still suffered from striking deprivation. Bertie became known as the foreman to his family. Such was his interest in labour issues. He also established the Duke of York's camps, through which boys from working-class communities and public schools competed in a wide range of events. These were a forerunner of the Duke of Edinburgh Awards latterly established by his son-in-law. Albert took a great personal interest in them and attended the camps every year in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, except for 1934, when he was ill. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Albert and Elizabeth must surely have believed that their lives would continue on the same trajectory as they had been on since their marriage. They would continue to play prominent roles in representing the royal family as Duke and Duchess of York, but the assumption was there that Bertie's older brother Edward would eventually marry, become king, produce an heir, and the royal line would continue through his family. However, by the early 1930s, it was imperative for Edward to marry at some point as he neared his 40th year. It was worrying for both the king and the government to discover in the course of the mid-1930s that Edward's attentions had actually landed on Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee who had come to England following her marriage in 1928 to Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an American businessman with extensive dealings in England. Edward and she had first met in 1932 and gradually entered into an extramarital affair. By 1935, when King George sanctioned the Metropolitan Police Special Branch to begin monitoring Simpson's movements, the relationship between her and the heir to the throne had become a matter of considerable concern to the royal family and the Conservative Party Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, when he entered government that summer. Although news of the affair had not become public knowledge at that time, it was widely believed that if it did, it would become a cause of major scandal, both because Simpson was a divorcee at a time when divorce still carried considerable social stigma, and also because Edward and she were romantically involved while Wallis was still married to her second husband. The affair would soon change the course of Albert's life. Albert's father, King George V, died on the 20th of January 1936, in large part owing to a lung condition exacerbated by lifelong chain smoking, underlying medical conditions and habits which were shared by his sons and which plagued their later lives as well. He had been considerably ill since the mid-1920s, but by 1935 matters were very poor indeed. In his final months, he had expressed his hopes that if Edward continued with his relationship with Simpson, that they would not have children, and that the way would soon be clear for Albert to succeed to the throne one day. That would come sooner rather than later. Although Edward immediately ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII following his father's death in January 1936, there were discussions taking place immediately within Baldwin's government about what course should be followed if Edward insisted on marrying Simpson. As Edward did not have any children, Albert was necessarily part of these discussions from their inception, as he was next in line to the throne. It was clear that if Edward were forced to abdicate, Albert would almost certainly succeed him, although there were rumours in the mid to late 1930s that the government was considering the possibility of one of Albert's two younger brothers, Prince Henry and Prince George, as possible candidates to succeed Edward if the crisis deepened. George, it was held at the time, was viewed in particular as a possible king, as he and his wife, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, had become parents to a son, Prince Edward, in October 1935, and thus he would have a male heir already if he became king. However, there is no evidence to suggest that the idea of Henry or George succeeding Edward was ever seriously entertained by Baldwin's government, and the plan from the very start of the abdication crisis was for Albert to succeed his brother if Edward ended up renouncing his throne. Edward's coronation was planned for the 12th of May 1937. He would not remain as king for long enough for it to be held, though. The first months of his reign saw a growing standoff with Baldwin concerning his relationship with Wallis Simpson. Edward was seemingly determined to marry her, and for her part, Wallis was taking steps to divorce her second husband in advance of marrying Edward. She had informed friends that she expected to be crowned as queen the day that Edward was crowned as king. This would not be the case. Baldwin was utterly opposed to Edward's proposed marriage, and in the autumn of 1936 began liaising extensively with the wider royal family, particularly Bertie, who was reluctantly acclimatizing himself to the reality of succeeding his brother within a matter of weeks, a development which he had no desire to see occurring. News of the affair eventually broke, and it was made known to the nation in the newspapers on the 2nd of December 1936. Thereafter, despite efforts by some senior members of Parliament, such as Winston Churchill, to support Edward's right to marry whom he pleased, it became abundantly clear that Parliament sided with Baldwin's approach. Pressured into making a swift decision, Edward agreed to abdicate rather than end his relationship with Simpson. He did so on the 11th of December, upon which Albert succeeded as King of Britain and Emperor of India, taking the regnal name George VI in honour of his father. He was a reluctant king and later revealed that when he had to visit his mother and tell her the news of the abdication and his assumption of the throne, he wept. George rose to the position of king well. His style of rule was modest and undramatic, in stark contrast to the controversy and drama which had surrounded Edward as Prince of Wales and during his brief time as king. Over the next 15 or so years, he would fulfill the role of monarch and its constitutional remit very well, rarely exceeding the role which the monarchy was largely confined to by the middle of the 20th century, which was to represent the royal establishment well and act in a ceremonial capacity. Nevertheless, this was still an important function, particularly so when Britain entered a period of extreme hardship from the autumn of 1939 onwards. Moreover, George's modest and unassuming personality was a good foil to the larger-than-life character of Winston Churchill as Prime Minister when war would come just a few years into his reign. Politically, George was conservative in his views, but not staunchly so, and was well suited to overseeing the gradual modernization of the country, both socially and culturally. George had come to power at a time when the political map of Europe was in flux. Following the end of the First World War in 1918, the continent had experienced 5 years of brutal revolutions and civil wars in regions like Russia, Turkey, Poland, Ireland, and Germany. But eventually, in 1923 and 1924, the chaos subsided, and several years of major economic growth and prosperity had followed. This was checked by the Wall Street crash in the autumn of 1929 and the Great Depression which followed. As renewed political turmoil arose across Europe, many countries turned to more extreme politics. In Central Europe in particular, far-right nationalist and fascist parties had emerged to claim power in countries like Austria, Hungary, and above all, Germany, where the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, seized power early in 1933. Conversely, Eastern Europe was dominated by the totalitarian Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. Those few countries which retained a democratic governmental system were threatened by the vying forces of fascism and communism, and shortly before George succeeded to the throne, a bitter civil war had broken out in Spain between these left and right-wing political forces. The task before Britain in the first years of George's reign was to navigate this difficult political environment, preventing the rise of both the British Union of Fascists under Oswald Mosley and excessive social unrest wrought by the political left. And George's task in acting as head of state at this time was not helped by Edward and Wallace's decision to undertake an unofficial tour of Nazi Germany in the autumn of 1937, one in which Edward clearly displayed his appreciation of German National Socialism. When George became king, Britain was at a crossroads in terms of how to approach the German threat. It could begin rearming rapidly in order to deter Germany from further aggression, or try to appease Hitler and the Nazis by granting them concessions, principally in the shape of reversals of some of the more punitive aspects of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end. George was in many ways a favourer of appeasement, but the principal architect of this approach was Neville Chamberlain, who succeeded Baldwin in May 1937 when he stood down as Prime Minister. Chamberlain continued a policy of slow rearmament while also allowing Germany to re-emerge as the major power in Central Europe. Thus, few objections were raised when the Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria into a Greater Germany, was undertaken by the Nazis in March 1938 in direct violation of the peace treaties which had brought the war to an end. George supported Chamberlain in this approach, but in doing so he was actually following the constitutional remit of the monarchy by the 1930s, which was to support the government of the day and its decisions regardless of whether or not those same policies ran contrary to the monarch's own views. In one instance, and a particularly significant one at that, George did directly associate himself with Chamberlain's policy. Following the annexation of Austria in the spring of 1938, the Nazis had turned their attention to the Sudetenland, the German-speaking region of western Czechoslovakia, making claims to this territory. Eventually, a diplomatic conference was convened to be held in Munich in September 1938. In the lead-up to it, George offered to write directly to Hitler to try to appeal to him, as one ex-serviceman to another, to try to prevent war. This was well-intended, though considerably naive in retrospect. When Chamberlain reached an agreement with Hitler at Munich to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland in return for a promise of no further aggressive actions or claims on its neighbour's territory, George sent him a message requesting him to visit Buckingham Palace immediately on his return to England so that the king could express his immense congratulations on what he perceived to be a major diplomatic victory. The appearance of the monarch and the Prime Minister on the balcony of Buckingham Palace together when Chamberlain arrived in England was a striking statement about their combined belief in the success of appeasement. But they would soon realise how misguided their faith in the agreement reached at Munich was. In the summer of 1939, despite the troubled political headwinds in Europe, George and Elizabeth headed across the Atlantic Ocean and visited the United States. The tour of the US was undertaken on the invitation of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Occurring between the 7th and 12th of June, it has a significance as being the first time that a British monarch had ever visited the country. No British monarch had agreed to do so since the US, which had been born out of Britain's colonies in North America, had declared its independence in 1776, and even prior to this, no monarch had visited the colonies since their establishment in the early 17th century. The tour took in much of the East Coast, with visits to Washington, D.C. and New York, as well as Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington in Virginia. The state visit was an important one in making the British royals visible to the American public, and was conceived of by Roosevelt as a way of generating support in the US for providing aid to Britain in the event of war breaking out. It was a shrewd diplomatic move, one which did not see US sentiment in favor of intervening in the Second World War when it initially broke out, but which helped Roosevelt to persuade Congress to provide financial and material support to Britain in the early stages of the war. Close ties between Britain and the US would soon be needed, as Chamberlain's efforts at appeasement were proven to have been in vain by the time George and Elizabeth toured the US in the summer of 1939. No sooner had the dust settled on the Munich Agreement and the Sudetenland been annexed into a Greater Germany than Hitler and the other senior members of the Nazi regime began turning their attentions towards further land grabs. The winter of 1938 was relatively calm, but the following March, the Munich Accords were torn up as German troops entered Czechoslovakia and occupied the country, which became a protectorate of Nazi Germany. Just days later, the city of Memel on the Baltic Sea coast was annexed after being threatened with an aerial bombardment by the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. By now, Britain and France had begun to accelerate the speed of their rearmament in preparation for the inevitable conflict, but they were far behind where they needed to be. The Nazis were aware of this and consequently accelerated their own march to war. In the summer of 1939, their attentions turned to Poland, making diplomatic claims to Polish territory which Germany had been forced to cede in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the First World War to an end. Finally, in late August 1939, a false flag operation was run to make Poland seem like the aggressor in Eastern Europe. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany declared war on its eastern neighbour and invaded Poland. 2 days later, in response to this aggression, Britain and France went to war with the Nazis. The Second World War had commenced. As the King of Britain and Emperor of India, the task fell to George on the 3rd of September 1939 to address the nation upon Britain's declaration of war on Germany earlier that day. At 6 p.m. that evening, he delivered his speech, broadcast over the radio. While Winston Churchill's addresses to the nation during the war usually garner greater attention, George's on Britain's entry into the war was also galvanizing. In it, he stated, "In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to all my peoples, both at home and overseas, this message with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war. Over and over again we have tried to find a peaceful way out of the differences between ourselves and those who are now our enemies. But it has been in vain. If one and all be resolutely faithful today, ready for whatever service or sacrifice it may demand, with God's help, we shall prevail." George's maiden speech to the nation during the conflict was delivered without any trace of the stutter which had plagued him for much of his youth. Although the award-winning film The King's Speech contains many aspects of George's story which are historically accurate, his challenges concerning his stutter were primarily faced and overcome with the assistance of Lionel Logue in the mid to late 1920s. Though George did periodically consult with Logue over the years, including during the Second World War, nevertheless, the film is inaccurate in suggesting that the king only began to confront his stutter in the period immediately before the war. With the onset of the war, there was a growing problem in the heart of government. Neville Chamberlain remained as Prime Minister and retained the support of the bulk of the Conservative Party. However, there was a rebellious faction amongst the Tories, and many in Britain felt that Chamberlain's position was untenable, given that he had championed the policy of appeasing Germany after he became Prime Minister in 1937. Matters came to a head in early May 1940 during the so-called Norway debate in the House of Commons, which began concerning British efforts to open a front in northern Norway following the country's occupation by the Nazis, but which soon morphed into a wider debate on Chamberlain's management of the war. It became clear that he could not remain on as Prime Minister, but there was a debate as to who should succeed him, with some favouring Winston Churchill, a long-standing Conservative critic of the Nazis and appeasement, and others supporting the candidature of Lord Halifax, an ally of Chamberlain's who was not entirely opposed to negotiating peace terms with Germany. George was initially in support of Halifax, holding a grudge against Churchill over his support for Edward and opposition to George becoming king back in the early winter of 1936. However, as events unfolded in the early summer of 1940, it became clear that Churchill was the candidate who could command cross-party support in Parliament, and on the 10th of May 1940, George asked Churchill to form a new government. The case was urgent, as the Germans had invaded Belgium and the Netherlands that morning, heading towards France. A cross-party coalition government conceived on the widest basis was soon established. Though he opposed Churchill's ascent as Prime Minister initially, once he occupied 10 Downing Street, the relationship between George and Winston became one of the closest between any British monarch and Prime Minister in modern history. The exigencies of the war ensured that they had to meet regularly, and they soon bonded over their common interest in the Navy, Churchill having served as First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War, while George was at sea in the North Atlantic. Things grew from there. By the late autumn of 1940, their formal meetings had been replaced by informal lunches between King and Prime Minister every Tuesday, ones which would often last for several hours and in which Churchill related the actions of government while George explained what he felt the mood of the nation was based on his extensive meetings with the public, which were taking place on an almost daily basis. We know of the considerable friendship which developed between the pair in the course of the war owing to George having recorded them regularly in his diary. It was not always smooth sailing, notably in the spring of 1944 when Churchill had to convince the King that he could not take part in the D-Day landings, not even on board the warships at the rear once the beachheads had been secured, but generally the relationship was a successful one, in large part because Churchill encouraged George, a naturally shy and retiring man, that he had a considerable public role to play in the war. He made him feel useful. A sign of their affinity for one another would be seen many years later when Churchill was delivered the news of George's passing at 10 Downing Street. He was said to have laid aside his papers and stated, "Bad news, the worst," and descended into a deep gloom for several days. George's close relationship with Churchill was in many ways forged in the dark days of the autumn of 1940. Following the Nazi invasion and rapid conquest of the Low Countries and France in the summer of 1940, the Blitz, a bombing campaign of Britain initiated by the Nazis, combined with a naval blockade of Britain in the North Atlantic, commenced. The Blitz began on the 7th of September with the goal of bringing Britain to negotiate peace terms without the Nazis having to launch a land invasion of Britain. London was the prime target from the beginning, but George and Elizabeth took the decision to remain in the capital. It was a hazardous decision. Over 1,000 people alone were killed in the city on the first night of the bombing campaign, and on the 13th of September, the King and Queen were very nearly killed when several bombs landed on Buckingham Palace. More broadly, the royal family underwent the same rationing that was imposed on the entire British public during the war years, and the sense of shared struggle galvanized the nation and won George and Elizabeth the admiration of the British people even as the Blitz dragged on for 8 long months through to May 1941. By the time it ended, over 40,000 British civilians were killed and 2 million homes had been damaged or destroyed, the majority of the damage being inflicted on London. The worst of the Blitz and the naval blockade ended in the spring of 1941. This was entirely owing to the general drift of the conflict. Between the summer of 1940, after the swift fall of France, Britain and the North Atlantic became the crucible of the war. The King needed to be visible during this, Britain's darkest hour in the conflict. However, from the summer of 1941 onwards, the focus of matters shifted as Hitler and the Nazis abandoned their designs on forcing Britain to surrender and instead turned their attentions eastwards to the Soviet Union, undertaking the largest land invasion in military history. Thereafter, the Eastern Front became the focus of the war in Europe, while after the entry of the United States into the conflict in December 1941, Britain, the US, and the Commonwealth nations turned their attentions to gaining victory in the North Africa campaign against the Italians and the German expeditionary force which had been dispatched there. They finally emerged victorious in the spring of 1943, after which a southern front was opened in Italy by the Western Allies. 12 months later, in the summer of 1944, a Western Front was established with the D-Day landings and the invasion of France. From that point onwards, the course of the war and the result seemed destined to be one of Allied victory. In September 1940, in the aftermath of the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk in northern France earlier that summer, and the commencement of the Blitz and the Battle of the North Atlantic, George championed the creation of 2 new awards which would be bestowed by the Crown. The George Cross and the George Medal were both created in September 1940. Unlike the Victoria Cross, which had been established during the long reign of George's great-grandmother and other military honours, the George Cross and George Medal were to be awarded to anyone who was deemed to have conducted themselves with gallantry and bravery, be they civilians or soldiers. In the context of the Blitz, when ordinary Londoners, and in particular firefighters and police, were effectively the front-line soldiers in the war against Germany, such awards were deemed necessary by the King. The George Cross would become the civilian equivalent of the Victoria Cross, the highest military award of its kind. In announcing the creation of the new honour, the King stated that, quote, "I have decided to create, at once, a new mark of honour for men and women in all walks of civilian life. I propose to give my name to this new distinction, which will consist of the George Cross, which will rank next to the Victoria Cross, and the George Medal for wider distribution. It was to be awarded for acts of the greatest heroism or of the most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger." Over the course of the war, George would personally present the awards to dozens of soldiers and civilians. Those who were honoured included the likes of Stuart Archer, a bomb-defusing expert who had defused over 200 bombs that had landed undetonated in England by September 1941. John Bridge was another Medal of the Cross for his role in defusing dozens of bombs which landed in urban centres across England. The George Medal was granted in similar cases, often to members of the Commonwealth nations. For instance, Margaret Irene Anderson, an Australian staff nurse on board the Empire Star, was awarded the medal for her gallantry during the evacuation of Singapore in the face of the Japanese onslaught in 1942. Back home, Charity Bick was awarded the George Medal by the King. She had lied about her age at just 14 in order to be accepted into the Air Raid Precautions Unit in 1939. During an air raid on West Bromwich by the Germans the following August, she delivered messages on her bicycle to a nearby RAF control room and helped her father put out an incendiary bomb that fell on the roof of a shop. In awarding these honours to individuals like Archer, Bridge, Anderson and Bick, George galvanised public sentiment to continue the struggle against Germany during the dark days of late 1940 and early 1941, when Britain stood largely alone against the Nazi threat. George and Elizabeth contributed to the war cause in other ways. From 1940 onwards, the King and the Queen Consort were regular visitors to hospitals and various fronts in England and further afield. From the summer of 1940 onwards, they regularly visited sites of extensive bombing raids to console the victims' relatives and to meet the wounded. Often, these duties were divided up, with George heading for military bases and Elizabeth touring London's hospitals and those in the other major cities. One might look at these as merely symbolic gestures, but symbolic gestures at a time of civilian endurance were what was needed at the time, and the King and Queen earned plaudits for their very visible public presence throughout the Blitz and the remainder of the war. As the focus of the conflict shifted away from Britain in 1941, and the Western Allies began taking the offensive on several fronts, George often left England, heading to the front lines in North Africa and the island fortress of Malta in 1943, and visiting France, the Low Countries and Italy in 1944, after the southern and western fronts had been opened. By 1944, the war was entering its final stages as Germany found itself being advanced on from the east by the Soviets and from the south and west by the Western Allies. George did not play an entirely silent role in these affairs. He made some contributions towards Allied strategy, notably in 1943 when he proposed that the Allies should forego opening a new front in France in favour of pushing resources into the southern front in Italy, a strategy which Churchill was considerably in favour of and sent along to the military chiefs of staff. In the end, though, George saw the logic of opening a front in northern France, and on the evening of the D-Day landings he delivered a rousing broadcast in which he recalled the grim position Britain had been in 4 years earlier, before stating that, quote, "Once more, a supreme test has to be faced. This time, the challenge is not to fight to survive, but to fight to win the final victory for the good cause." That eventual victory would take another 11 months to secure, but in the end, as Soviet troops closed on central Berlin, and British, American, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers fanned out across Germany, Hitler killed himself, and the Nazis surrendered on the 8th of May 1945. That VE, or Victory in Europe Day, George and the rest of the royal family appeared on the balconies of Buckingham Palace to celebrate, with the British public, the end of the near 6-year-long struggle. With victory in the war, George's role shifted from being Britain's war leader to overseeing the rapid dismantling of its empire. Promises had been made during the war to many interested parties concerning increased autonomy as the reward for helping Britain in its struggle against Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. In particular, the Cripps mission of 1942 to India had promised the Indian National Congress leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi that India would be allowed to hold elections and have greater self-determination in the aftermath of the conflict if it committed fully to aiding Britain in its hour of need. Now, the debt fell due. In 1947, India was granted its independence and the British Raj was divided up, so that the Muslim majority areas in the northwest and northeast became the new state of Pakistan, though the province of East Bengal would later become the independent nation of Bangladesh. George briefly remained as Emperor of India even after independence, but the title was abolished entirely in 1948, though India and Pakistan would remain as members of the British Commonwealth. Thus, in the second half of the 1940s, George was overseeing the first steps of the post-war transition from the Empire to Commonwealth, including the 1949 London Declaration, which was pursuant from India's declaration of itself as a republic and the removal of George as head of state of that Commonwealth nation. George was cautiously in favour of this move, provided India remained a Commonwealth nation, though the episode did see the Republic of Ireland leave the Commonwealth entirely. The further dismantling of Britain's empire would gather pace in the 1950s, particularly from 1957 onwards, when the first wave of decolonization spread across Africa. By the mid-1960s, Britain would relinquish much of its control of its territories in regions like Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and Rhodesia, many of which new nations in turn became members of the Commonwealth. But George would not live to see this. His health was deteriorating already in the late 1940s, though he was only just after entering his 50s. Like his father before him, his lifelong chain smoking had taken its toll on his health, as had the stresses of the war years. Moreover, by the late 1940s, he was suffering from several circulatory problems, including Buerger's disease, which leads to clotting of small and medium arteries, and which is also exacerbated by smoking. By 1949, matters were serious, and a planned tour of some of the Commonwealth nations had to be cancelled, while for a time it was feared that George would have to have one of his legs amputated. Unsurprisingly, by this time his eldest daughter and the heir presumptive to the throne, Elizabeth, who was only 23 years of age, was carrying out more and more royal duties by the end of the decade. Matters did not improve into the 1950s. In 1951, George had to have his left lung surgically removed after he developed lung cancer. He was limited in his physical movements from that point onwards, although the king attempted to remain active, insisting on accompanying his daughter and her husband Prince Philip to London Airport on the 31st of January 1952, when they left for a tour of much of the empire. It was the last time he would see his daughter and heir. George died in his sleep a week later on the 6th of February 1952 from a coronary thrombosis at Sandringham, where he was born. He was just 56 years of age. Owing to his premature death, Elizabeth succeeded to the throne of Britain at just 25 years of age, and as she lived to be 96 years herself, her reign would be the longest in British history. News of George's death was released immediately, and the mechanisms for the holding of a state funeral were put in place. His body lay in state at Westminster from the 11th of February onwards so that the British public could pay their respects to the wartime king. His funeral was held on the 15th, like those of so many British monarchs, at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Afterwards, his remains were interred in the royal vault, though they only remained here until 1969, at which time George was reinterred in the George VI Memorial Chapel. His remains lie there today, with those of his wife, Elizabeth the Queen Mother, who lived until 2002, outliving her husband by half a century, and those of his daughter, the recently deceased Queen Elizabeth II, and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip. George VI led Britain through one of the most consequential periods in world history, and arguably the most significant in Britain's long imperial story. For much of 1940 and 1941, the country was the only major power standing against Nazi Germany and the fascist threat. In that dark moment, the country needed leadership. It is generally understood to have come from Winston Churchill, but there was also George and Elizabeth as his queen consort, who acted as figureheads in the struggle against the Blitz and the blockade of Britain by Germany. He rose extremely well to that occasion. Moreover, it came from a man who was never supposed to become king. His older brother's love life, and to a certain extent his difficult personality, having combined to ensure that his reign was a short one, and Edward had to abdicate in favour of George in December 1936. When he did become King of Britain, George cannot be said to have been a philosopher king or a particularly forceful personality, but he offered a steady hand and humility at the helm of state which was fitting for the time period in which he became monarch. Overcoming his own personal limitations, he won the respect of the British people throughout the war, developed a close relationship with Churchill, and managed the transition from Empire to Commonwealth well in the aftermath of the conflict. Tragically, his physical decline ensured that his reign was cut short and that his last years were spent in considerable pain. He should be remembered as a modest and humble but effective king. What do you think of King George VI? Was it a good thing that he became King of England and that Edward abdicated the throne in 1936? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon were born less than 5 years apart. He came into the world in December 1895. She was born on the 4th of August 1900. However, despite being born relatively close to one another, they died half a century apart. George's chronic respiratory problems and subsequent cancer led to his premature death in February 1952 at 56 years of age. Elizabeth would live for a little over 50 years longer, dying in March 2002 at 101 years of age. In that time, she became known as the Queen Mother, the matriarch of the royal family who lived to see her children, grandchildren, and many of her great-grandchildren grow up. There is no sign that she ever contemplated remarrying or another relationship. Instead, she continued the work she had carried out while Bertie was alive. She remained a rock of stability and offered advice to her daughter, the new monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, where previously she had been the pillar that her husband relied on in the dark days of the war. No other royal would epitomize the modernization of the monarchy as much as the Queen Mother did. When she was born, Queen Victoria sat on the throne and Britain's empire stretched around the world. When she died, the third millennium had started, Britain's empire was long gone, and the monarchy as an institution had been transformed. The woman known to history as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was born the Honourable Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon on the 4th of August 1900 at St Paul's, Waldenbury, a modest stately home near Hitchin in Hertfordshire, England. One of 10 children altogether, Elizabeth was the fourth and youngest daughter of Claude Bowes-Lyon, the Lord Glamis, who became the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. When her father inherited the Scottish earldom in 1904, she became Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The Bowes-Lyon family is descended from the Royal House of Scotland, with one of Elizabeth's 14th century ancestors becoming the Thane of Glamis, whose family seat was Glamis Castle, the setting of William Shakespeare's Macbeth, some 300 years earlier. Her mother was Lady Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck, a descendant of William Cavendish Bentinck, the 3rd Duke of Portland, and a former Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1783, and then of the United Kingdom between 1807 and 1809. Spending most of her childhood between Glamis Castle and St Paul's, Waldenbury, she engaged in field sports and enjoyed the company of dogs and horses. Of all her siblings, she was particularly close to her young brother David. There was only a 2-year age difference between them, and they were often inseparable and liked to play pranks on people together. Elizabeth was also extremely well educated due to her private tutoring at home, and by the age of 10, spoke French fluently. For a time, she was educated by a German Jewish governess, Käthe Kubler, and passed the Oxford local examination with distinction at the age of 13. The Great Britain in which Elizabeth grew up would have appeared to her peaceful and tranquil, and Elizabeth's status as a lady and as a member of the upper classes meant that she had a relatively easy life. Through the Victorian era, Great Britain had become one of the most advanced countries in the world thanks to its preeminence in trade and an empire that reached all four corners of the globe. However, it was not without momentous social and political change. Between 1910 and 1914, the Great Unrest, as it was termed, saw a mass upsurge in labour militancy and wave upon wave of strikes. 4,000 strikes were recorded involving around 4 million workers over that period, and trade union membership rose from 2 million to just over 4 million. Some actions were aggressive, violent, and insurgent. This was seen during the bitter South Wales coal strike in Tonypandy in 1910, the railway and dock strikes of 1911, and in a general strike of transport workers in Liverpool in the same year, which resulted in clashes between strikers and troops. Triggered by anger over poor wages, a 70-hour week, and compulsory overtime, mass picketing at Llanelli railway station on the critical route from London to Ireland via the ferry at Fishguard was brutally suppressed by the police and troops. 2 men were shot dead and many others were wounded. The troops' action led to a day of widespread disorder and rioting. A movement to gain women's right to vote eventually succeeded through Acts of Parliament in 1918 and 1928. It had become a national movement during the Victorian era, with the formation of the National Society for Women's Suffrage founded in 1872. It remained largely ineffective, even after the creation of the more vocal National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, led by Millicent Fawcett, which still maintained it could achieve its aims through peaceful means. The campaign took on a more militant face with the establishment of the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia. These were the suffragettes whose tactics included parades, hunger strikes, stone throwing and smashing windows. In 1913, suffragette Emily Davison became a martyr to the cause by throwing herself under the King's horse at the Epsom Derby that year. While politics was put on hold at the start of the First World War, limited suffrage was, however, extended in 1918 not only to 8.4 million women, but also to 5.6 million disenfranchised men. 1928 saw legislation to extend suffrage to all men and women over the age of 21. Another crucial moment which would come to dominate British history and the life of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in the 20th century was the political situation in Ireland. A movement aimed at gaining self-government for the island of Ireland had become the dominant movement in Irish nationalism since the 1870s. Successive Home Rule bills championed by the Liberals have been defeated towards the end of the 19th century, either in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. A third attempt in 1912 was seen as only affecting moderate reforms and inflamed militant nationalists, eventually leading to the Easter Rising in 1916, the Irish War of Independence, and a treaty creating the Irish Free State with Dominion status in 1922, which allowed for the 6 counties of the north to remain part of the United Kingdom. The Irish Republic came into being in 1937. While these 3 issues dominated Elizabeth's early years, they would eventually be eclipsed by the outbreak of the First World War on the 4th of August 1914, her 14th birthday. During the war, her home of Glamis Castle became a convalescent hospital for troops who had been injured in the conflict, but who were expected to make a full recovery, and so did not need as much medical attention as other patients. Elizabeth was too young to become a nurse, but she did assist with welfare work, tending to wounded soldiers and helping with their rehabilitation, and, by all accounts, was very popular and well-liked. 4 of her older brothers served during the First World War. Her brother, Fergus, was an officer in the Scottish Black Watch Regiment but was wounded and killed in action during the 1915 Battle of Loos. Her brother Michael was also a soldier, and on the 28th of April 1917 was reported missing in action. It was later discovered that he had been wounded, taken captive, and moved to a prisoner of war camp, where he stayed until the end of the conflict. Strangely, one of the soldiers Elizabeth cared for wrote in her autograph book that she was to be hung, drawn and quartered, hung in diamonds, drawn in a coach and 4, and quartered in the best house in the land. By tradition, young women from noble and gentry families would be presented at court at the start of the social season. After being presented to the British sovereign, these débutantes, as they were called, were allowed to take part in all manner of balls, parties, and horse racing events, which was a sign that they were eligible for marriage. Elizabeth was presented to King George V in 1919. She was, however, no stranger to the royal family, with the children of the then King George and Queen Mary occasional visitors at her home at Glamis Castle in Scotland. In 1922, she acted as one of the bridesmaids at the wedding of their only daughter, Princess Mary, to the 6th Earl of Hereward, Henry Lascelles. During one such high society event, Elizabeth was introduced to Princess Mary's brother, Albert, known as Bertie within the family, and who at that time was second in line to the throne. Albert first proposed to her in 1921 when she was just 20 years old, but Elizabeth turned him down, fearing the restrictions that a royal marriage might bring to her life. Elizabeth did eventually accept his proposal, and on the 13th of January 1923, their engagement was publicly announced. Albert's choice of Elizabeth was seen at the time as the monarchy modernizing, as previously it was common for princes to marry members of other royal houses. Prince Albert and Lady Elizabeth were wed on the 26th of April 1923 in Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding to be held there since that of Anne of Bohemia to Richard II in 1382. Breaking with tradition, Elizabeth placed her wedding flowers on top of the tomb of the unknown warrior to honour her brother Fergus. Lady Elizabeth henceforth became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. After their wedding, she and Prince Albert quickly began to perform royal engagements together. Their first joint appearance after their wedding was at the RAF procession in Hendon held on the 30th of June 1923. One of the most significant royal engagements they had together, however, was in July 1924, when they visited Northern Ireland. Due to the success of this visit, the then Labour government decided that the couple should embark on a tour of East Africa from December 1924 to April 1925. However, in November 1924, the Conservatives defeated Labour in the general election against a backdrop of political unrest in what was then known as Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, modern Sudan and South Sudan, which saw the assassination of the Governor-General Sir Lee Stack. Despite this, Albert and Elizabeth decided to embark on their royal tour, visiting Aden, Uganda, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and Kenya, though they avoided Egypt due to political tensions. Around this time, Elizabeth encouraged her husband to see a speech therapist. All his life, Albert had dreaded making speeches because of a severe stammer. His closing speech at the British Empire exhibition in 1925 had proved a particular ordeal. The couple were introduced to an Australian speech therapist called Lionel Logue, who suggested daily hour-long vocal exercises which greatly reduced his stammer and gave him greater confidence in public speaking. Whenever Albert was due to make a speech, Logue was often called in, and he was regularly invited to the royal family's Christmas dinner to oversee the King's Christmas message. The relationship was later dramatized in the 2010 film The King's Speech, directed by Tom Hooper, and which starred Geoffrey Rush as Logue, Colin Firth as King George VI, and Helena Bonham Carter in the role of Elizabeth. On the 21st of April 1926, their first child, Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, later to become Queen Elizabeth II, was born. Shortly after their daughter's birth, Albert and Elizabeth embarked on another royal tour, leaving their newborn daughter behind. It's known that Elizabeth greatly struggled with leaving their daughter behind, but their tour to Australia, Jamaica, Fiji, and back via the Panama Canal was regarded at home as a great success for public relations. 4 years later, their second daughter, Princess Margaret Rose, was born on the 21st of August 1930. Margaret was born in Glamis Castle and was the first royal baby to be born in Scotland since 1600. The registration of her birth was delayed to avoid Margaret being the 13th name in the parish register, which was seen as a bad luck omen. On the 20th of January 1936, King George V passed away from chronic bronchitis, and his popular eldest son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, succeeded to the throne to become King Edward VIII, starting a brief reign that would be marred with controversy and disapproval towards his love life, a situation which would haunt Elizabeth's life forever. As Prince of Wales, Edward had started a friendship with an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. He was known to be deeply in love with her. While the relationship was widely reported in the United States and in European newspapers, it was largely kept out of the British press by arm-twisting by the government of the day. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, had attempted to persuade the king to give up the relationship and explored the possibility of a morganatic marriage whereby Wallis would not become queen and any children would not accede. This was ultimately rejected by Baldwin and the Prime Ministers of Australia, South Africa and Canada. Ultimately, Edward VIII chose to abdicate, addressing the nation by radio to say that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. On the 10th of December 1936, in front of Albert and their 2 other brothers, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. Thereafter, he flew to the continent, where he eventually married Wallis Simpson. On the 11th of December 1936, the man who was never meant to be king, Prince Albert, became King George VI, and Elizabeth became Queen Consort. Their coronation took place on the 12th of May 1937, the same day that Edward was due to have been crowned. Elizabeth was now Queen of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions, as well as the Empress of India. The scandal regarding Edward VIII was far from over, however. While Elizabeth was still supportive of her husband's decision to allow Edward to create his elder brother Duke of Windsor and to retain the title of Royal Highness on the advice of the cabinet, Wallis was not to be given this title, a decision which was said to have saddened the new king. However, there was no love lost between Elizabeth and Wallis. Wallis reportedly referred to Elizabeth as Cookie, believing that she was similar in appearance to a fat Scottish cook, and Elizabeth was known to simply call Wallis that woman. Elizabeth remained bitter that the abdication had forced her husband onto the throne reluctantly and unprepared. She also remained convinced that these events had ultimately shortened her husband's life, leaving her a relatively young widow. In the spring of 1938, the political climate across Europe was tense, and talk of war was common. A royal tour of France was organized to cement relations between Britain and France in the face of potential German aggression. 5 days before the royal couple's departure, the Queen's mother, the Countess of Strathmore, died. The trip to France was postponed, and the court went into 3 weeks' mourning and dressed in black, to be replaced after a few weeks by grey and then mauve after that. The Queen's couturier, Norman Hartnell, had already devised a wardrobe for the trip to France in pastel colours and floral patterns, which was now regarded as entirely inappropriate. Thinking on his feet, he came up with what's become known as the white wardrobe, white having been the colour of deepest mourning among medieval queens. French queens had traditionally worn white in mourning, and the king's great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, had been buried in white. The team had 2 weeks to prepare the costumes, which were favourably received in France and turned the Queen into an unlikely style icon. In March 1938, the German Chancellor Adolf Hitler annexed neighbouring Austria in a process known as the Anschluss. He then turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, where around 3 million people in the Sudetenland region spoke German. Neither Britain nor France felt ready to defend Czechoslovakia against the Germans and were anxious to avoid military intervention at any cost. Both countries believed that peace could only be maintained by making territorial concessions. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, proposed a 4-power conference in Munich to discuss the situation, at which Hitler promised to find peaceful means to resolve differences within Europe. Chamberlain returned to London, pledging peace in our time. The royal family and the Prime Minister had always had a close relationship, and after the signing of the Munich Agreement on the 30th of September 1938, Neville Chamberlain joined the King and Elizabeth on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the first Prime Minister to ever do this, and received rapturous cheers from the crowd. This sense of unity and patriotism was to be short-lived. Chamberlain and the actions he took against Hitler may have been popular with the public, but politically this was regarded as a different matter. Elizabeth had been wholly supportive of Chamberlain and had agreed that Hitler must be dealt with delicately, but the House of Commons were highly critical of Chamberlain's solution. Following the 1938 Munich Agreement, both Britain and France quickly moved to rearm, with many believing that war with Germany was now inevitable. From May to June that year, King George and Elizabeth embarked on a tour of Canada and the United States. This was the first time reigning monarchs had embarked on a tour of the country. During the trip, a veteran from the Boer War asked Elizabeth whether she considered herself Scottish or English, to which she replied that she was a Canadian. This response and the tour in general were extremely successful and changed the public perception of King George and Elizabeth, many of whom had believed the couple to be less suitable to royal life than Edward VIII. Speaking to the then Canadian Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, Elizabeth expressed her belief that the Canadian tour was the making of George and Elizabeth as King and Queen, and that she would continue to return to Canada often throughout the rest of her life, whether that be a visit for work or pleasure. This transatlantic tour was seen not only as an opportunity to assert British dominion over Canada, but also as a means of ensuring American support and involvement in the event of war in Europe. While in the United States, the royal couple spent some time with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, even staying with them at the White House and their residence in the Hudson Valley. The American First Lady reportedly spoke highly of Elizabeth and considered her a suitable and capable monarch and queen. By the early part of 1939, Hitler had become determined to invade Poland. In a cat's cradle of alliances, Britain and France had pledged to support Poland if it should be attacked by Germany. Meanwhile, in secret negotiations, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Russia, agreeing to share Poland after the invasion. The scene was set for war. Germany invaded Poland on the 31st of August 1939, prompted by a false flag attack, and a day later, Britain declared war on Germany. A massive evacuation plan was ordered to take civilians, mainly children, away from the cities and ports in an operation called Pied Piper. Public air raid shelters were built, with millions of so-called Anderson shelters set up in people's gardens. After the surrender of France in June 1940, England remained as Germany's sole enemy, and Hitler planned to undertake an amphibious invasion, ordering the Luftwaffe to establish complete dominance in the skies over England in preparation. War came to London in earnest on the 7th of September, when hundreds of German bombers and fighter planes descended on London in what became known as the Blitz. The operation lasted for 57 nights in a row. The targets for the bombers were principally in the East End of London and the docks. But very few parts of the capital escaped, with Buckingham Palace bombed on at least 9 occasions. The King and Queen refused to leave the country during the Blitz despite the inherent dangers and as obvious targets for enemy action. Elizabeth insisted also that her daughters should remain too, against the advice that they should be sent to Canada. In a letter to Queen Mary, Elizabeth described one bomb attack on the palace which saw a direct hit in the quadrangle and the destruction of the palace chapel. She spoke of her pride in the behavior of the servants. Just a short time later, In an act which was to enamour the King and Queen to the British people, she visited a bomb site in West Ham, where she spoke of walking in a dead city, all the houses evacuated, and yet through the broken windows one saw all the poor little possessions, photographs, beds, just as they were left. During the Blitz, the royal couple were seen as key in keeping up morale and helping the war effort. They came to be seen as the embodiment of the struggle against fascism and as a reminder of what the British were fighting for. Rejecting the advice to flee to safety abroad, Elizabeth was quoted as saying, "The children will not leave unless I do. I shall not leave unless their father does, and the King will not leave the country in any circumstances." Queen Elizabeth contributed to the war effort in many other ways. For example, she sponsored the publication of the Queen's Book of the Red Cross. Appearing in November 1939, this book aimed to help the funding for the Red Cross during the war. Its authors included A. Milne, who wrote the Winnie the Pooh stories, the novelist Daphne du Maurier, and the poet T.S. Eliot, and included photography by a close friend of the royal family, Cecil Beaton, along with artwork by Arthur Ragg. Using her position and role as a caring and doting mother, Elizabeth would also take part in radio broadcasts and try to comfort and help encourage families that had been separated during the war, whether it was children who had been evacuated to the countryside or fathers who were fighting overseas. Many members of the staff working at Buckingham Palace were fighting in the army, so Elizabeth and her husband would spend their days at Buckingham Palace, but then leave for Windsor Castle later in the day. This was both for their own personal safety and to be closer to their family. Elizabeth was always known for being an extremely hard-working royal, and this was evident even during the Second World War. Elizabeth would visit troops, factories, hospitals, and any other places that were targeted by the German Luftwaffe. She also paid numerous visits to the East End of London. Despite Elizabeth's best intentions, these planned visits did not always go down well with the crowd. Elizabeth was sometimes met with hostility, especially regarding her fashion choices in a time of war. The people of the East End found Elizabeth's choice of brightly coloured and clearly expensive clothes to be distasteful and a clear representation of the separation between Elizabeth and them. However, Elizabeth and her stylist Norman Hartnell had deliberately chosen to not wear black, as it was felt that black was reminiscent of funerals and could be seen as a bleak and depressing colour. She regarded the colours she wore as a token of hope. After Buckingham Palace was bombed, Elizabeth stated that she was almost relieved as she believed she could now be seen as an equal to those living in the East End. Elizabeth's actions and sense of duty during the war, and the significance of her being a wartime queen, remains one of the things she is fondly remembered for. Edouard Daladier, the French wartime Prime Minister, held Elizabeth in high esteem and was impressed by her conduct as Queen and the support and encouragement she gave to her husband and the people of her country. It's believed that Hitler believed the same, describing her as the most dangerous woman in Europe, and describing her popularity as a threat to German interests. And so, despite her wariness and disapproval of the conflict, many historians regard her character and actions as key and central to the winning of the Second World War, as was the strong bond that developed between her, the King, and Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister after the resignation of Neville Chamberlain in May 1940. The Second World War came to an end on the 2nd of September 1945. In the general election that followed shortly afterwards, there was a surprise defeat for Britain's wartime leader Winston Churchill, and a Labour government was returned under Clement Attlee, triggering a period of considerable social change, most notably the creation of the welfare state. The political views of the British royal family, in the past century at least, have been a closely guarded secret, and whilst it can never be fully known where Elizabeth's true political beliefs and alliances lay, many historians do believe that she was one of the most supportive conservative monarchs. However, it is rumoured that Elizabeth had told her close friend, the British politician and journalist Woodrow Wyatt, that she liked and was fond of the Labour Party, despite the popular historical belief that Elizabeth thought that only the poor and uneducated voted for Labour. Elizabeth had also told her family member, the Duchess of Grafton, that she actually loved the Communists. However, Elizabeth wasn't always the perfect royal. Whilst the King, Elizabeth and their children were touring South Africa in 1947, Elizabeth mistook one of their admirers' excitement at seeing the royal family as an act of attempted violence, and as a result, hit him with her umbrella from the royal car. However, this is regarded as the only incident of Elizabeth breaking royal protocol and acting unprofessionally. This same year, 1947, saw her eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth, marry Prince Philip, a former Prince of Greece and Denmark. Philip had been corresponding with her daughter since she was 13 years of age in 1939, and after serving in the Royal Navy during the war, asked the King for his daughter's hand in marriage in 1946. The King consented, but asked for the engagement to be delayed until Princess Elizabeth's 21st birthday. The ceremony took place at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November, 1947. Some biographers have suggested that Elizabeth and other members of the royal family had disapproved of Philip's relationship with Princess Elizabeth, partially because his sisters had married German noblemen who had Nazi links, but also because he was without financial means. His family had been exiled from Greece after his uncle was forced to abdicate for military failures during the Greco-Turkish War in 1922. Elizabeth is believed to have initially teased Philip by giving him the nickname the Hun, though later conceded that he was indeed an English gentleman. Following the wedding, the King and Queen were due to embark on another royal tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1948, but the trip had to be delayed due to the King's deteriorating health. In their public broadcast to the nation in April 1948, celebrating their silver wedding anniversary, the King thanked his consort Elizabeth and spoke very highly of her and of her constant support throughout their marriage. That year, George VI had to stop public appearances for a period of time because of a pain that he felt in his right leg and foot, one that the doctors believed to be thromboangiitis obliterans, also known as Berger disease. His case, where his arteries had become severely hardened and had become swollen, was so severe that amputation had been considered. On the 12th of March 1949, the King endured a procedure known as a right lumbar sympathectomy, an injection given in his leg to relieve him of his pain by blocking the sympathetic nerves in the leg. While both the King and Elizabeth were dealing with these issues surrounding his health, they also became grandparents on the 14th of November 1948, when Prince Charles was born to Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Throughout the remainder of her life, Elizabeth would share an incredibly close bond with her grandson and was central to encouraging him in his passion for the arts and culture. Even though King George VI appeared to be recovering and seemed to be in better health, it was Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip who embarked on the royal tour of Canada in place of the King and Queen in October 1951, the princesses' first tour of Canada. This was a year after the birth of their daughter, Princess Anne, on the 15th of August 1950. The King's last public appearance with his wife Elizabeth was in May 1951, when they opened the Festival of Britain together in front of an audience of 3,000 people. This festival was aimed at restoring patriotism and pride in being British, as well as being a celebration of the end of rationing and victory in the Second World War. However, just a few months later, on the 23rd of September 1951, the King underwent a pneumonectomy, the removal of his left lung at home in Buckingham Palace after a lung cancer diagnosis, which was due to his heavy smoking. By December, the King had somewhat recovered, although in his Christmas Day address on the 25th of December 1951, it was clear that his speech sounded slower and his voice was deeper than usual, although this was most likely due to the removal of his left recurrent laryngeal nerve during the surgery, which can affect the sound of one's voice. Whilst the King was attempting to make a full recovery in the hope of resuming his royal duties, his daughter Princess Elizabeth and her husband Philip embarked on another royal tour of the Commonwealth, this time taking in Kenya, New Zealand and Australia, starting in January 1952. Before they left for this royal tour, Albert had decided to wave them off at London Airport before their departure, despite medical advice not to. This was the last time that Elizabeth would ever see her father, and it was the King's last ever public appearance. The British public had been kept in the dark about the health battle facing the King, and so for many it was a shock to see George VI looking so ill on the newsreels in the cinema. On the 6th of February 1952, King George VI passed away in his sleep. The royal physician, Dr. James Ansell, declared that the King had died from a coronary thrombosis. It was believed that Ansell had not been aware of the King's cancer diagnosis due to the level of privacy surrounding the royal family. Indeed, the actual cause of the King's death was never actually made public. The press reported that the King died from a blood clot in his heart. Princess Elizabeth was given the news of her father's death while she was at the Treetops Resort in Kenya by her husband, Prince Philip, on the 6th of February 1952. She was now Queen Elizabeth, and her mother was to be known henceforth as Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a title by which she is best known today. Elizabeth initially struggled with the death of her husband and chose to retire from royal life and duties. Not only had she lost her husband, but also her role in public life, along with her husband's many royal houses: Buckingham Palace, Sandringham in Norfolk, and Balmoral in Scotland. It was decided that she should move out of Buckingham Palace into Clarence House, a modest residence which it's understood she disliked intensely, but she also chose to buy a house on the west coast of Scotland as a retirement home. It was the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who visited her that summer in Balmoral to urge her not to retreat from public life, as Queen Victoria had done after the death of her beloved husband, Albert. Churchill was keen that she should be on hand to support her daughter as she navigated her new role as Queen. Subsequently, she resumed royal duties, attending functions and openings, and flew to the United States to receive a check for the George VI Memorial Fund. She became a patron to more than 300 organizations and made history by becoming the first female Chancellor of London University and the first female Lord Warden and Admiral of the Cinque Ports. However, her principal role was very much as a supportive and encouraging influence on her daughters. The Queen Mother remained especially close to her daughter Margaret, and due to their special bond, they both embarked on a royal tour of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which later became Zimbabwe, Zambia and Malawi, from the 1st of July to the 16th of July 1953. This was the Queen Mother's first international visit since the state funeral of her husband on the 14th of February 1952 at Westminster Hall. Even though this royal tour was originally scheduled to be carried out by Princess Elizabeth, the tour was regarded as a great success. The visit to the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland is regarded as a key moment in her onward career as a royal figure and kicked off a new chapter in her royal life. During this tour, the Queen Mother placed the foundation stone for the University College of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, now the University of Zimbabwe. In 1957, she became the university's president and would often attend their events when possible. Despite her support for education in Africa, there are persistent suggestions that the Queen Mother held racist views. However, whether they went beyond those prevalent in society at the time is uncertain. Some historians and biographers of the Queen Mother report her support for racial segregation, apartheid, and white supremacy in Rhodesia. She has even been accused of supporting the Empire and the British rule over African countries, which she believed were not able to rule themselves. On the other hand, a former equerry to the Queen Mother, Major Colin Burgess, has denied the suggestion that the Queen Mother ever made racial insults and slurs, although he does report in his book, Behind Palace Doors, that she was often ignorant of current affairs. Furthermore, the Queen Mother never publicly voiced offensive views, if indeed she held them, and so it is difficult to prove the veracity of the claims. The British historian and a former Conservative, Sir Robert Rhodes-James, has said that the Queen Mother had told him that she did not agree with discrimination regarding race and opposed apartheid. While her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was finding her feet, she still commanded enormous respect in the royal household. At the start of the new Queen's first royal tour of the Commonwealth as monarch, from 1953 to 1954, the Queen Mother remained in Britain and acted as the Counsellor of State. This meant that, as a more senior member of the royal family, the Queen Mother carried out many of the duties commonly done by the reigning monarch, such as signing official documents and carrying on royal business in the monarch's absence. The Queen Mother's fondness for Scotland is undisputed. After being widowed in 1952, she had bought the partially derelict Barrowgill Castle and its surrounding estate and planned to restore the building so it could be used as her holiday home. From the years 1953 to 1960, much work was done on the castle, including the plastering and supply of electricity and water, which was the first time the castle had had these resources. From 1955 until her death, the Queen Mother would visit the Barrigill Castle for 3 weeks in August and for almost a fortnight in October. She was said to visit this castle as an opportunity for escapism and peace, away from the distractions of life in London. One such distraction was her youngest daughter Margaret's controversial relationship with former Battle of Britain pilot, Group Captain Peter Townsend. Townsend had served as King George VI's equerry or assistant from 1944 until the King's death, and had been kept on by the new Queen. Peter Townsend was also appointed as the comptroller to the Queen Mother in 1952, which meant that he was charged with overseeing the spending of her royal household. According to several sources, Princess Margaret first met Peter Townsend when she was 14, but the romance only began 8 years later, after the death of her father. The group captain was 16 years older than Margaret, and later confessed that he had been attracted to her intense beauty and sense of humour. The relationship had been kept from the public eye, but an off-guard moment at the Queen's coronation, where Margaret was seen to pick some fluff off the group captain's uniform, fueled speculation in the international press. Townsend had served in the Indian Civil Service, and when he returned to Britain, he'd married Cecil Rosemary Pratt, Marchioness of Camden, after a short engagement, and the couple had had 2 sons. After his wife's infidelity, he filed for divorce. It was his status as a divorcee that made it impossible for him to marry Margaret, as it was against the teachings of the Church of England. Parliament was also firmly against the union. As defender of the faith, the head of the Church of England, her sister, the Queen, was unable to sanction the relationship. A compromise was proposed. Under the terms of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, no descendant of George II could marry without the permission of the reigning monarch. It was suggested that Margaret and Peter Townsend wait until the princess turned 25 years of age and was thus deemed to be capable of making her own decisions. Townsend was posted to Brussels as an air attaché at the British Embassy, but even by the time of Margaret's 25th birthday, the Queen had still not given her approval for the marriage. Despite changing attitudes and a lingering sadness among the British public that Edward VIII had been unable to marry for love and retain his royal status, permission was still not given. The Prime Minister of the time, Anthony Eden, was himself a divorcee and had subsequently remarried, and one might expect that he would be sympathetic to the princess's plight. Eden did amend the Royal Marriages Act, but in a way that was regarded as cruel and unfair. The change would have allowed Margaret and Townsend's marriage, but the princess and their future children would be removed from the line of succession as a result. Whilst Eden did highlight that Margaret's removal from the succession would not affect her status as a royal in any way, in the end, Margaret chose not to marry Townsend. On the 31st of October 1955, Princess Margaret made her position clear that she was mindful of the teachings of the Church and was conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, and that she had decided to put these considerations before any others. Margaret was said to be heartbroken, but ultimately moved on. Despite tension and friction between her daughters, the Queen Mother lived a rather peaceful, private life as a widow. Her love for field sports and animals continued throughout her life, and now, as Queen Mother, she had more time to dedicate to these passions. A deep affection for horses was a love shared between the whole family, as her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was also an avid admirer, and she developed a new interest in steeplechasing, a race in which horses must jump over various fences and terrain obstacles. This fascination with the sport came as a result of her friendship with Anthony Bingham Mildmay, the second Baron Mildmay of Fleet, who was an amateur steeplechaser. He sat next to the Queen Mother at a dinner in Windsor Palace in 1949, where he struck up a conversation with the then Queen, in which he recommended that Elizabeth should buy a horse that she could share with her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. With the help of Mildmay's trainer, Peter Cazalet, the horse Monaveen was selected for the Royals, and this horse won its first race at the Fontwell Park Racecourse in October 1949, where it won the Chichester Handicap race. The Queen Mother's horses won 500 steeplechase races, and she was an avid follower of every steeplechase race, even having the commentaries piped directly to her place of residence in Clarence House, although it is unclear whether she actually placed bets on these races or not. As well as a love for horses, the Queen Mother also enjoyed angling. In 1982, after nearly choking on a fish bone and having to have the stuck bone removed surgically at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, she joked that that incident was simply an act of revenge by the salmon she had caught. Another lifelong interest was collecting various artworks. Whilst she acquired most of her large collection during her time as reigning monarch, she was always continually adding to her collection of art and often developed a close bond with her favourite artists, such as John Piper or Edward Seago. She also had a liking for artwork that had been inspired by previous royals, such as the sketches made by the Scottish painter Sir David Wilkie for his portrait of Queen Victoria in her youth. She was also supportive of artists who had been active in the Second World War. Among many other works, her collection included paintings by Monet and Augustus John, and a number of Fabergé eggs. It was not long before the love life of Elizabeth's daughter Margaret took centre stage again. In the late 50s, she embarked on an initially scandalous affair with a photographer, Anthony Armstrong-Jones. Once again, the liaison was kept secret from the public, and yet there are suggestions that the Queen Mother not only knew about her daughter's affair, but actively encouraged it. At the time, Margaret shared Windsor's Royal Lodge with her mother, and it's been reported by biographers that the Queen Mother grew fond of the photographer, whom she dubbed Tony. Soon, Margaret was paying secret visits to Armstrong-Jones's studio in Pimlico, and he was a frequent visitor to the lodge in Windsor. He did so under cover of building an aviary for the Queen Mother. In 1959, the Queen Mother threw a party to welcome Princess Alexandra home from Australia, at which it was clear that Margaret and Anthony Armstrong-Jones had feelings for one another. They would marry a year later in a ceremony which was the first of its kind to be televised. On the 6th of October 1961, Armstrong-Jones was given the title of the Earl of Snowdon. On the 28th of May 1960, a few weeks after his marriage to Margaret, Armstrong-Jones's illegitimate daughter, Polly Fry, was born. She was subsequently brought up by a close friend of the Snowdons, and it wasn't until 2004 that she persuaded Lord Snowdon to have a DNA test which confirmed their link. From his marriage to Princess Margaret, the Queen Mother had 2 more grandchildren, David Armstrong-Jones, the 2nd Earl of Snowdon, on the 3rd of November 1961, and Lady Sarah Armstrong-Jones, now Lady Sarah Chatto, on the 1st of May 1964. Nevertheless, Margaret and Anthony had a turbulent marriage, with widespread rumours of adultery and drug use. While it's accepted generally that Anthony was the first to be unfaithful, Margaret went on to have affairs of her own. The couple divorced in 1978 in what was the first royal divorce since the annulment of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540. The Queen Mother maintained a close relationship with Armstrong-Jones, and it was believed that many members of the royal family supported him after their divorce. Increasingly, the Queen Mother encountered ill health. In February of 1964, she underwent an emergency appendectomy, which led to the postponement of her planned royal tour of the Commonwealth countries of Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji for 2 years. After the procedure, the Queen Mother recovered aboard the Britannia, the royal family's cherished yacht, during a Caribbean cruise. She would have 2 battles with cancer, with the first in December 1966, when she underwent an operation to remove a cancerous tumour after her colon cancer diagnosis. In 1984, the Queen Mother was diagnosed with cancer for the 2nd time. She was then given a diagnosis of breast cancer, which resulted in the removal of a lump in her breast. The public was not made aware of these health challenges at the time. Indeed, these issues with her health did not stop her from undertaking her royal duties, and she continued to be one of the most hard-working royals for the rest of her life. She embarked on over 40 official royal overseas visits, notably visiting Iran in 1975 at the invitation of the country's last monarch, the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. She was warmly received there, and it was reported that many were amused by the fact that the Queen Mother would engage in conversation with anyone, regardless of their hierarchy or status. Despite her busy schedule, time was always set aside for leisure. Between 1976 and 1984, she would visit France to spend her summer there every year, and she would embark on her own private trips to other European countries up until 1992. In 1981, the Queen Mother's favourite grandson, Charles, married Lady Diana Spencer. Diana's grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, had been one of the Queen Mother's ladies-in-waiting since 1956, and Diana blamed her for turning the Queen Mother against her. Princess Diana once told a friend in a secretly taped conversation that her husband's grandmother was always looking at me with a strange look in her eyes. She described it as interest and pity mixed in one. One issue that Diana reportedly found particularly galling was how the Queen Mother was demonstratively preferential towards her eldest son, Prince William, over her younger son, Harry. Later documentaries would claim that the Queen Mother would invite Prince William over for tea and not invite Prince Harry. In later life, however, she seems to have favoured Harry over William, leaving him a larger share of her estate than his elder brother. After Princess Diana's death in a car crash in Paris in 1997, the Queen Mother was said to have been upset at the criticism levelled at her daughter the Queen for being uncaring and insensitive to the mood of the nation. In 1987, a major controversy was revealed surrounding the Queen Mother, one that impacted her popularity to some degree. It was revealed that her nieces, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, had been wrongly listed as dead by Burke's Peerage, a yearly publication of aristocratic genealogy and heraldry, in 1963, claiming that Nerissa had died in 1940 and Catherine in 1961. In 1987, the tabloid newspaper, The Sun, published an article proving Burke's peerage as wrong, and instead informing the public the Queen Mother's nieces were instead living in the Royal Earlswood Hospital for People with Mental Disabilities since 1941. Both were classified as imbeciles in the terminology of the day. The paper revealed that neither Nerissa nor Catherine had ever learned how to talk, and they had essentially been cut off and ignored by their family, other than a yearly payment of £125 to Earlswood Hospital. When Nerissa passed away in 1986, no family reportedly attended her funeral. There have been mixed accounts regarding this controversial chapter in the Queen Mother's life. A documentary produced by Channel 4 in 2011, titled The Queen's Hidden Cousins, included claims made by nurses who worked at the hospital at that time that no members of the royal family, nor the Bowes-Lyon family, ever visited the girls. However, sources within the family argue otherwise. They maintain that the two sisters were often visited by their mother, Fenella Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's sister-in-law, until she died in 1966. It has also been claimed that the Queen Mother also began to develop a relationship with her nieces after learning that they were actually still alive in 1982 and would send them money for presents at Christmas time and on each of their birthdays. There has been no official confirmation of this. Throughout her life, the Queen Mother was heavily involved with charity work and became patron of MenCap, supporting those with learning disabilities in 1986. On the 4th of August 1990, the Queen Mother celebrated her 90th birthday. The landmark was commemorated publicly on the 27th of June 1990 with a parade thanking her for her service and endurance as one of the longest and hardest working members of the royal family. For her 100th birthday, 10 years later, another parade was hosted to celebrate her life and achievements. Actors such as Sir John Mills and Sir Norman Wisdom participated, and the Royal Bank of Scotland produced a special £20 banknote to celebrate this momentous occasion. However, the Queen Mother's health was quickly failing, although this did not prevent her from carrying out royal duties. Despite injuring her pelvis in December 2001, she refused to sit for the national anthem for her husband's memorial service on the 6th of February 2002 as a mark of respect for a beloved husband. Tragedy struck for the Queen Mother on the 9th of February 2002, just 3 days after the anniversary of her husband's passing, with the death of her youngest daughter, Princess Margaret, after suffering from her 4th stroke. Members of the royal family and the Queen herself were concerned about the Queen Mother making the journey from her place of residence in Norfolk to St. George's Chapel in Windsor, where Margaret was to be buried, but she flew there by helicopter, partially so no press would be able to take photographs of her in her wheelchair, which she did not like to use. Her last public appearance was on the 5th of March 2002, when the Queen Mother attended a garden lunch party for the Eton Beagles, a hunting society at the prestigious Eton School. On the 30th of March 2002, the Queen Mother passed away with her eldest daughter at her side at the age of 101. At the time of her death, she was the longest living member of the British royal family in history. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was laid in state for 3 days at Westminster Hall, and it's calculated that 200,000 people paid their respects to her there before her funeral on the 9th of April 2002. Her death was also marked in the Commonwealth, with the then Governor-General of Canada, Adrienne Clarkson, asking Canadian citizens to remember the Queen Mother and honour their memory of her on the day of her funeral. The Queen Mother was laid to rest beside her husband and their daughter Margaret in St. George's Chapel, and after her funeral, her wreath was placed on top of the grave of the unknown soldier upon her request, a repeat of her gesture at her wedding some 79 years before. The Queen Mother had a major impact on Britain throughout her life and reign, and it was her stable and loving marriage with King George VI and the support she provided him that has often been credited as saving the British monarchy in a time of immense social and political upheaval. Upon her death, the Queen Mother was remembered as kind and funny, and was one of the more liked members of the royal family, and this has only been furthered by her depiction in the popular Netflix drama The Crown. What do you think about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother? Do you think she was the saving grace of the British monarchy? Or were her rumoured racist views and neglect of her nieces an insight into her true character? Please, let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. George VI and the Queen Mother were an unlikely couple to become King and Queen of the United Kingdom. The royal succession was meant to ensure that King Edward VIII would rule for many years, but Edward's determination to marry Wallis Simpson dictated otherwise. For Britain, it was probably a serendipitous change. While Edward and Wallis went on to court the Nazis within months of his abdication, George began a reign that is very well regarded amongst Britain's modern monarchs, offering moral leadership during the Second World War and carving out a successful relationship with Winston Churchill as Britain's wartime leader, despite a less than promising start between the two men. Even before he became king, Elizabeth had been a bedrock of support for the reserved younger son of George V, encouraging him to overcome the speech impediment and other issues that had left him lacking in confidence as a young man. Their time as king and queen was notable in other ways too. George and Elizabeth, for instance, will forever have the distinction of being the last emperor and empress of India. Together, they navigated both personal struggles and profound political challenges, laying the groundwork in the process for a new British monarchy that would still have a great role to play in the world even after the sun set on Britain's empire.